Okay, let's talk about some basics of economic policy that states have to deal with. This is Chapter 5 in the book by Chap5, Power and Choice. Why is there a vast variation between states of the world as far as economics go? We've talked a little bit about how there's a dramatic divide between rich and poor countries in the world. Governments rely on a strong economy to give it the revenues that it needs to build infrastructure, to provide good education. However, as we've already talked about, the economy depends on what the government decides that it's going to be. We've talked a little bit about how colonialism has contributed through its 500 years of Western European domination, has contributed to this rich versus poor divide, which is very difficult to overcome for poor countries to get out of that. The states that developed into states first, particularly the Western European states, experienced a long, peaceful development, generally homogeneous cultures. That contrasts with the tremendous amount of conflict and instability that is in the poor states. And of course, there's differences in natural resources between states. Some states are abundant with natural resources, have a larger area to choose from, that sort of thing. And of course, one of the biggest differences is that how does the state decide on how to distribute or redistribute the benefits that it gets from its economic policy? And as we've already talked about, it all revolves around the political system and the political institutions that a state has, first of all, decided on how it wants to run its country, but then how that's evolved, or has it evolved successfully. Now, good, bad, right, or wrong has nothing to do with it. Western capitalism has evolved over time to be the dominant, I guess you could say, preferred economic system by default, partly because the Western Europeans developed it, got there first. It turned out to be very successful. The political competition that occurred during their formation of the states that we talked about in the previous chapter, that kicked their development into overdrive, and innovation and markets, property rights, where that was a fundamental foundation of their institutions in these Western European states. This is where the Enlightenment and the Renaissance in the era of scientific inquiry flourished, so that scientific development was very important to this area that continued to drive capitalism, which then, of course, continued to drive development. And then the representative governments, the democratic form of governments, also helped to spread this wealth because people were being represented better by government, then therefore they got to see more of the economic benefits. And bottom line, you could also say that the Western societies that got there first with capitalism created lots of development. Western societies have been good at providing things that people want. As we've said, this capitalist economy is becoming somewhat of the global economic system by default because of its flexibility, its adaptability, its ability to create wealth and prosperity. However, there are some serious negatives on capitalism that continuously have to be checked, monitored, regulated. Inequality is somewhat of a common factor of all human societies, but with capitalism it does seem to be a little bit more conducive to inequality because of the advantages of having wealth and accumulating wealth. Also, one of the tendencies of capitalism is for companies to get larger, and so that encourages monopolistic behavior. And then with capitalism, because of the volatility of markets, we experience boom and bust cycles. It's almost impossible to prevent these. Could perhaps minimize them with a little bit more foresight, but with the nature of humans in a market system, it's just something that's going to occur. The severity, of course, is going to vary as also as to when they would occur. This is just a quick little diagram of the circular flow of the market system. Here we have our firms and our households, and the government, of course, in the middle is the major players of this market system. So as you can see, the firms provide the goods and the services to the households, and then in turn, they provide back to the firms the labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurialism for the firms to create these goods and services. So it's a continuous cycle in that direction. And then in the other direction, the households are consuming these goods and services that the firms provide. And then in turn, the firms are providing the wages, income, as well as the profit to the owners, back to the households. The government in the middle, of course, is getting taxes in order to be financed from the firms and the households. And the government in turn does transfer payments back to the firms in the form of tax breaks and subsidies. And the government provides transfer payments back to the households in terms of things like Social Security, unemployment, and other benefits that people may qualify for. Now, there have been some responses to Western capitalism. We've already talked a little bit about socialism and communism. Communism has failed pretty dramatically. We are starting to get some social democratic aspects that are being introduced into capitalism. But as far as other types of systems, this import substitution was not as successful as expected. Now, contrary to that, the Asian tigers, particularly South Korea, were very successful in using what is called export-led industrialization, where having somewhat of an authoritarian system helped them a little bit in that the government directly intervened into its business investment, and the government protected industries to become exporters. So what, for example, South Korea did, as I may have mentioned briefly before, is that they became very successful in producing high-tech goods that could then be exported to the rich world. And that ultimately was very successful for them in plugging into this global capitalist system. So these are a couple of responses to Western capitalism. One of them tried to isolate themselves from it a little bit to produce their own goods that they would be better off importing, not quite as successful. And then as far as plugging directly into the globalist capitalist system, the Asian tigers, for example, became exporters of goods that the rest of the world, particularly the rich world, wanted to buy. Now let's talk about a couple of economic aspects that states have to deal with. One, of course, is inflation, which simply means increasing prices. Now, some inflation is pretty much inevitable, but of course, too much inflation can be very, very catastrophic for any society, particularly if it gets so bad that your savings become worthless and your money does not buy near as much goods as it did just a few days earlier. There's several causes for inflation, long term particularly, in that with excess demand over time, deficit spending, shortages in very important goods, monopolies can raise prices, trade restrictions and tariffs can also raise prices. Unemployment is another very important aspect that societies and governments have to deal with. And interestingly, there's somewhat of a trade-off in dealing with unemployment, there's a trade-off with inflation. It doesn't always hold up, but typically if you focus on inflation, that could be at the risk of letting employment get high. And if you focus on unemployment, that could potentially run the risk of letting inflation get high. Here's just an example of the trade-off. If you raise interest rates in order to alleviate inflation, because that's kind of reducing reducing the incentive for borrowing, and this could, of course, if firms have less incentives to borrow, or if people have less incentives to borrow to get their houses or the cars, that could slow the economy down and potentially increase unemployment. Now, contrary to that, if we're in a recession and we want to stimulate the economy, lowering interest rates would be a typical approach to that. In order to combat inflation or to alleviate recession, that's going to stimulate the economy and thereby reduce unemployment. We'll get into this a little bit more detail later, but what we want to talk about here is just some basics of what countries have to deal with in their economic policies. Now, another important factor of unemployment is what the government could do as far as stimulus programs, which means government spending. They would raise their deficit and use government spending to create public works projects that could call for temporary jobs. They could increase subsidies to firms to keep them producing, subsidies to people to keep them afloat while they're recovering from particularly a recession, which is where government spending may come into play. The government could also use their stimulus spending to retrain people to go to other industries that may have failed, in fact, be in part a cause of the recession because a certain industry has failed, or it could pay to relocate people to other jobs. So that's another thing that governments have to deal with. Now, as far as dealing with monetary policy, this is what central banks do, and our central bank is called the Federal Reserve. While Congress is in control of setting taxes and spending, the Federal Reserve, or the central bank of a country, is responsible for the monetary policy. Both of these are very important in trying to control the economy, to keep it on an even keel, to keep it producing so that you have a prosperous and successful society. So there's three main mechanisms that a central bank does. They are responsible for raising and lowering interest rates. So as I mentioned before, if we're in a recession, the central bank could lower interest rates in order to stimulate more borrowing, more lending. Therefore, firms would continue to build on their companies to keep the economy going. People would still borrow money to buy homes and cars, that sort of thing, in order to try to keep the economy going, to minimize a recession. They can also set reserve requirements. That simply means the requirement of how much reserves a bank is required to keep. So if in a recession, the central bank could lower these reserve requirements for a bank so they could loan out more money and therefore stimulate the economy. One of the most important things a central bank does is buy and sell securities as far as investing and borrowing. In a recession, for example, a central bank would buy a lot of securities in order to put more reserves into the bank's vaults. The economy was overheating, they would sell those securities back, take a little bit more money out of the system. That has to do with putting dollars in and out of the system for people to use to keep the economy going. What's very important about central banks is that they are fairly independent or autonomous. They are appointed typically by the president, but beyond that, they are what we would call a government corporation, where they have a considerable amount of independence to do this monetary policy. Now, why is that? Well, politicians would be more likely to attack unemployment in order to appease their constituents, and in the result of doing that, they could potentially let inflation get out of control, which would have a much more insidious effect on the economy. And so central banks, particularly over the last 30 years or so, have been really focused on maintaining a stable inflation rate. And you can see some charts in the book that indicate that as far as how well central banks have kind of kept inflation in check for the most part. So therefore, if you want to focus on inflation as opposed to unemployment, obviously you focus on both, but in order to try to maintain a stronger record on inflation, central banks have been independently able to do that. And as a result, by being independent and not having to be elected, they are better able to undertake unpopular policies such as buying lots of securities in order to try to stimulate the economy. So central banks, particularly our Federal Reserve, gets a lot of criticism and certainly not perfect, but they are independent and autonomous for a reason. Now, economic inequality is a concern that governments have to deal with, and capitalism, as we said, is somewhat more conducive to inequality. And inequality can create several problems in your society, and we're literally seeing a little bit of that in the United States. As inequality increases, there's a lack of trust in the system, in the government, because, for example, if the rich keep getting richer and we start to see a shrinking middle class or more people getting into the lower working class or in the poverty levels, there is less of a trust in the government, in the system. People start to have less political participation in the system because they feel somewhat left out or perhaps disillusioned by the system, that it's not working for them. And of course, in the United States in particular, since we are getting more inequality and we have a large population, we're starting to see that the poorer populations are really skewing a lot of our indicators as far as poorer health and poor education, because of the larger segment of population is unable to afford things like more nutritious food or health care or better education, all of those things that money can provide. The possibility of unrest and instability in your society could increase with inequality. And we do know that the greatest differences are found in poor states, and that contributes to them being unstable and underdeveloped. So it's a part of this continuous cycle that they can't get out of. However, the United States stands out among the rich states as being very high in inequality. And we are 95th in what is called the Gini coefficient, which is simply just a measure between 0 and 100. 0 meaning perfectly equal, 100 meaning perfectly unequal. We are fairly high. As far as the modern industrialized countries of the world, the United States is probably one of the worst in terms of inequality. Here's a sampling of selected countries and their Gini coefficient. As you can see right here, Sweden and Norway are the most equal countries in the world. And as you go up the chart here, United States is ranked 95th in the world, almost at the halfway point there, in terms of inequality, ranked even behind Iran here in the Gini coefficient. So the United States inequality is getting worse, and it's therefore becoming a concern that's being addressed by our political system and requires some major political decisions to address that. There is somewhat of a resistance in the United States is that, well, if I'm rich, I wouldn't want the government to try to prevent me from becoming rich just in order to try to alleviate inequality. So there is somewhat of a cultural resistance in the United States to attacking inequality, even though we do see some potentially dysfunctional situations occurring if it keeps getting worse. Corruption is another major problem that many states have to deal with, particularly the underdeveloped states that have not evolved into a political culture or a stable democratic form of government. This can consist of lots of many different things: bribes, cozy relationships, job patronage, which means your government will give you jobs in return for favors, campaign contributions, which is a normal part of all democratic societies. But of course, there's a fine line there that if you give a lot of money directly to a candidate, you could literally buy that candidate. And then, of course, no bid contracts eliminates competition, and therefore you develop cozy relationships between corporations that are going to get contracts without even having to compete for them. So the price of corruption is phenomenal. Some studies have shown adds approximately 15% to the national debt in Italy, uh, adds 36 more to your tax burden in a country like Turkey. Now, United States, very, very low as far as corruption goes, but there's a lot of criticism with the United States lobbying system as a legal form of corruption. It's perfectly legal as far as firms spending money to help politicians make their decisions. And however, it does have an influence. This is why corporations and wealthy individuals can influence government more so than average middle class people can, is because they are constantly spending money to help politicians pass policy. And so, therefore, policy is going to get passed that is going to favor those people that are helping them. While it is legal, it can cross the lines into bribery and corruption. And so, therefore, have to keep a close eye on it. But there's a lot of criticism about lobbying, which provides no useful benefit to society other than just helping a corporation get more advantages than it already has. And of course, it's a product of cultural norms, whereas in many societies, particularly patronage type societies, for example, in Latin America, where you typically have a clientelist system, to where that's kind of how things get done. In that, if you want something to occur, you might have to pay extra for it or bribe for it. And of course, in the post colonial states, that legacy of corruption of how things get done has been there for a long time and fairly difficult to overcome. We do see corruption as more pervasive when there's a rapid change in the system. For example, in the Soviet Union, when it collapsed and tried to shift to a market capitalist system, there was a quick change there, and some people who are opportunists would come in there and potentially take advantage of that shift in change and perhaps breed some corruption in order to gain access to the changing system. Presences of foreign businesses are also somewhat conducive to corruption. In order for them to get work, they may potentially increase the opportunities for bribes. Poor countries, as we said, products of colonialism, more apt to have corruption. And this is just a very general comparison here. There's certain traditions, such as the Protestant work ethic. Now, again, that's not singling out Protestants as good, bad, better, or whatever. It's just the work ethic that's associated with it has also correlated with less corruption, as well as the Confucian ethic of the mutual obligation, as far as leaders becoming obligated or beholden to their people. So those are some examples of how studies can show some correlations as to where there may be more or less corruption. Now, the process of globalization, which we've touched on a little bit, is the tendency for the world to start coming together, integration of economics, transportation, communication systems, and cultures across national boundaries. The author of a previous book looked on his desk and found all of these products in his house there that came from other countries. So there's lots of things that we depend on that we have to get from other countries. So it's not like this globalization is necessarily something that's new or perverse is that we've constantly, for a long time, relied on getting products from other countries. However, our current state is more often equated with global capitalism. And of course, we know capitalism has several negatives that go with it. And that is one of the big concerns with globalization, is that we are potentially evolving into a global system of capitalism, which has, again, problems that come with it, as well as some resistances that come with it. So the main factors that are influencing this globalization is government policies. Since the Depression and since World War II, trying to get together, come together on a common economic system that everybody seems to be comfortable with, that is shown to be its rather flexible and adaptable, then that is the tendency. And democratic internationalism, we'll talk about this more in detail later, but democracy has been somewhat kind of come with market economies as a package deal. They just seem to go hand in hand. If you get freedom in choosing your leaders, then you start to get freedom in choosing your jobs and buying your products and that sort of thing as well. Now, the technological advances have been enormous, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, but recent production techniques, transportation, communication, the internet, these have all served to bring us together globally, which has also facilitated global capitalism. As countries become more prosperous, or their political systems become more in tune to trying to develop their economy, then the demand for raw materials increases. Trade, as we've already mentioned, the imports account for 23% of our U.S. goods and services. So 1/4 of what we consume comes from trade. Investment is a very big driver of the global economy. We've got multinational corporations that are working all over the world, producing goods, hiring people from foreign countries. Multinational banks are where the investments get stored, the loans get made, and these are becoming global players. And of course, the liquid investments of stocks and bonds is also becoming an important part of the global capitalist system for investing. We're also seeing that culturally, the world is coming together in certain aspects of an amalgamation, and this may have something to do with capitalism, and therefore there's some resistance to that, because some countries say, well, I don't want you to push your Western style capitalism on me, or even your Western style democracy on me. We want to do it our own way. But there is considerable amalgamation, particularly in entertainment and sports and certain types of goods, particularly with respect to youth. What youth find to be cool could be potentially universal all around. If youths in Africa find something cool, youths in America, your youths in China can potentially find that cool as well. So there's the amalgamation aspect of it. And then, of course, as we become more of a capitalist society, again, this is not good, bad, right, or wrong. This is just kind of how it tends to be evolving. Well, materialism, which you could probably argue is a part of our nature to be somewhat materialistic, to get things to make our lives better, to consume or collect things that make us happier, that's part of our nature. So therefore, the materialism and consumer products that people want to buy is a part of the driver of this global capitalist system. We also know that the multinational corporations are continually looking for better ways to improve their profit. So outsourcing and finding cheaper labor in other countries is certainly a driver. Now, that's one of the major concerns, because this push for cheaper labor would mean that multinational corporations are not getting it in the United States or in their home country. So that's been a major concern, particularly over the past 20 to 30 years of our global capitalist push here, is that multinational corporations are exploiting that to pay less taxes and get cheaper labor. And as we see with capitalism, the benefits are not distributed equally in the first place, and they could be actually getting more unequal as we go to a larger global capitalist system. Poor states are pressured somewhat to compete with this global capitalist system, and in order to do that, they have to open up their economies to trade, to investment, and to transparency. So that puts pressures on them that they may not be ready for, and it actually exacerbates their problem. Multinational corporations are gaining power as a result of this global capitalist system. There's no global regime to regulate multinational corporations, so therefore they can pick and choose where they can go. Countries compete for them by lowering their taxes and reducing regulations. So multinational corporations are quite considerably the biggest benefactors of this global capitalist system. And again, back to poor states, they lack adequate economic basis to compete. Their infrastructure is already weak. Their education is already weak, and that makes it even more difficult for them to compete with this globalist system. So it may even be making their problems even more difficult. Now, as far as the quiz, how do you explain this global capitalism, and what are the major problems concerned with it as far as this globalization, this global capitalization? And then what do central banks do in general, and why are they given independence to do that?